Welcome everybody to Clearly, the show where if it's complex, confusing, or controversial, it is covered here. We are back. Last time we were in spiritual disciplines, the what is it sort of territory, the why is it, pitfalls to avoid, those types of things. And today we're getting real practical and just jumping into the kind of how-to of sort of 5 of the big boy spiritual disciplines in the Christian life, what it looks like to walk with Jesus practically. So,
and you'll get to hear about what that looks like in our lives as well.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
I hope you enjoy. So the 3 that feel to me like non-negotiable, like top tier, to me there's different levels of like, this is highly important. The top 3 for me are Bible reading, prayer, and church. So maybe it sounds weird to call church a spiritual discipline, but I think it is, and I'll make an argument for that. But a relationship, we're talking about a relationship, right? We're talking about knowing a person. And in any relationship, there has to be a mutual disclosure of one another. That's how you get to know somebody, right? Like, that's the only way we build friendships, is I tell somebody else things about me, like I'm honest with them and they are honest with me. And so far as we can be honest with one another and hear one another out, the relationship can grow in depth. As soon as you lose one part of that back and forth, it's no longer a deepening relationship. So you need both. If I'm just talking to somebody all the time and I'm never listening to them, that's a problem. If they're talking to me all the time, but I will never disclose myself to them, the relationship's not going to go very deep. And if I'm not willing to receive them as who they are and share myself as I really am, then that's going to hinder depth of intimacy. And I think the same is true with God. And so the way in which we have that back and forth with him primarily is through the word, through the scriptures, and then through prayer. It's through the word that we hear from God, that God discloses himself to us, which is why I'm such a big fan of reading all of the Bible, because all of it reveals him. And if I pick and choose what I want to read about God, then that would be very similar to me looking at my friend and them wanting to talk about something and me being like, nope. I'm not interested in that part of your life. I'm not interested in hearing that. That makes me uncomfortable. Please don't talk about that. It's like, okay, well, that's going to hinder depth of intimacy that I have with that person. The same is true with God. So he's given us 66 books that reveal who he is, what he's like, what he loves, what he doesn't love. It reveals what he's done in the past, what he's going to do in the future, what he's doing right now. And this is a living and active word. But that sounds maybe really boring, like to read the Bible that way and go, what does this tell me about God? But that's how we build any relationship. You meet a new person. Where'd you go to school? Where do you live? What do you like? We learn facts about each other. And those facts slowly over time build for us a character that we see in that person and we grow to love and know. And that's what the scriptures are. The scriptures are God speaking to me. And so, by the way, consistency is so much more important than long periods of time, volume. Like, if I can't spend an hour with God, then, or 30 minutes in the Word, whatever you can do every day is what you should do. And if that's 10 minutes right now, then do that every day. 10 minutes every day. Whatever you can do every day is more important than a length of time. That's going to be more transformative. And then increase that over time. But you have to start with baby steps. Too many people, when they want to grow in anything, go, I'm going to aim for way up here. And then you just give up. So 10 minutes a day, pick a book of the Bible, read books of the Bible, not verses. Pick a book, read it, 10 minutes a day. And then pray. That's what I'm saying. You have to talk, you have to hear from God, right? That's part of how we do that, is through scriptures. But we have to respond to him. If we do not speak back, if we don't share our hearts honestly about how we feel about that, then we are hindering the depth of intimacy that can happen with him. And what prayer is conversation with God. And it's part of how we, like the Psalms say, we pour our hearts out to him. And prayer, the highest value for me in prayer is honesty in my own heart. And that is brutal honesty. So that means if I read something, which has happened in books like Revelation, where you read something, you're like, oh gosh. And my prayer after that sounds like, God, I just read about, all the people that are being thrown into a lake of fire. I really don't like that. And I'm uncomfortable with that. And here's exactly how I feel about it. As soon as we put on the churchy hat of Lord, let me say all the right things, it's like, okay, we've missed the point. Real me has to meet real God. And so that means I need to start with where I'm really at. And there's a way to do that I think is still respectful and honoring him. And I think he invites that. The Psalms are full of questions and full of people saying, Lord, where are you? Why are you this way? As long as we're talking to him, it's good. And so prayer is me pouring out my heart to God. And I need to start where I am, honestly, and I need to talk to him. For me, prayer, the whole pray as you go thing is really hard. I do pray a lot through the middle of my day, but it's never very intimate and long because I end up just thinking about stuff. It's not praying anymore. It's just mulling over things, So for me, praying I have to stop what I'm doing. But isn't that true of anybody else I talk to? If I'm talking to a friend, there is a way in which we can talk while we're doing stuff. But if you really need to talk about something meaningful, you both stop and talk to each other. And so I journal. That's one way that I force myself to I will write out my prayers. But sometimes I'm talking out loud, which can feel awkward if you're not used to doing that at first, but I think is really valuable. Sometimes go on a walk and talk out loud. Sometimes somebody drives past you a little crazy. That's okay. Those have been really helpful. And just kneeling or sitting or laying down. Something about I'm going to get my body on the ground where I can't move around. I'm a mom with 4 kids, so there's always something to do. But if I'm on the ground, I can't do anything. And so that's actually been a really postures for my body have been really helpful to force me to go, I have something to say to God and I need to talk to him.
That's good.
And in a way that honors his presence with my focus and my attention. And I think we should be praying continually, as Paul says to the Thessalonians. But I think there's a time, like you said, for those. I'm going to set aside an hour. I'm going to set aside time. I'm going to talk to him.
Yeah.
And then the last top tier thing for me is church. Hebrews tells us, do not forsake meeting together. And then Jesus, when Paul is on the road to Damascus, right, to persecute the church, Jesus interrupts him and looks at him and says, why are you persecuting me, Saul? He looks at a man persecuting the church and calls it me. And we know that the scriptures tell us that the church, the gathering of the saints, is the very body of Christ, that Jesus identifies himself in a very personal way with the corporate gathering of his people, and then tells us we need to be a part of that. And so I gather with other saints and sinners, and you're going to get hurt, and it's not going to be pretty, and it's going to be messy, and there's no perfect church. So just if you're looking for it, does not exist. But still, I think it's a spiritual discipline to go, I'm going to show up here. And essentially what we're doing in church is practicing what we do privately, but together, right? We hear the scriptures. We hear from God. We pray together to God. We sing to God together. And there's something about the corporate gathering of the saints that's really important for us as a means to connect with God. That's one of the ways that he meets us in really tangible ways is through other believers. And there's something sacred about the weekly gathering. Yeah.
There is, the way we talk about it at our church, Stonegate, a lot is every Sunday we are rehearsing the gospel with one another. Mm-hmm. And that's not just a content thing either. It is a content thing. We're going to be singing songs that have the cross at the center. Our sermons are going to be from text of scripture. It's going to be boasting in Jesus. It's going to be all those things. But actually just our bodies getting in the rhythms of gathering, posturing ourselves in postures of longing and need. Oftentimes when I'm leading a prayer, I'll ask our church to open up their hands to the Lord together as just a communicating with our body, a posture of lack and need for Jesus. I think all those things, doing that week in, week out, are preaching communion, for instance, right? When we're now engaging with our other senses, the death of Christ. All of those things are means of grace for God's people that start training us. But you don't even feel it in a moment. When you're taking communion, you're not like, I am really learning deep things about the God. Maybe you are. I've had moments like that where communion is like that. But I definitely know that over time, the ritual of I'm taking bread, I'm hearing somebody look me in the eye and say, this is Christ's body broken for you. I'm taking it. I'm tasting the sweetness. I'm chewing. I'm swallowing. I'm drinking all of that. It's doing something. Those rhythms of grace, especially corporately, are I think you're right to say they're really significant. And that's why, as an aside, I think the online church world thing has been a gift in this COVID season. But for anybody who's listening, I would just please encourage you, don't let it stay there because we are embodied people meant to be with other embodied people. And I would just hate for you to miss out on what Hebrews 10 talks about when it calls us to assemble together. The next thing it says about it is it's encouraging one another. It's just really hard to do that. It's impossible to do that when you're just consuming, a stream online. And but you're right; it has a forming effect on people to gather with the saints. Even if your church isn't perfect, even if you have things changed, there's something about it that really does something in us. Yeah.
Just hearing people sing next to you, right? As you get to know people and what they're going through, and then you over time get to know, wow, I know that person just lost their mom, and now I'm next to them or they're behind me and I hear them singing. It's like there is truly something supernatural happening in the gathering of the saints. And we feel it sometimes in really profound ways, and a lot of times we don't. These kind of all these disciplines are kind of like this. They're like a stream of water like carving into the earth, like you'd think about what the Grand Canyon is and how it's been carved over years by water or a rock being formed. It's a slow, transformative thing that sometimes you're aware of and sometimes you're not, but it's the consistency that matters. And so I always want people to feel like, man, when you show up at church, the consistency of just, I'm going to be there unless I'm sick. I'm there, and I feel that. And it's like, I need to be there because I need God. That's why I'm there. I need to connect with him, and this is one way he's told me this happens. And so I'm going to show up, and some days feel awesome, and some days feel frustrating, and some days feel painful as I experience wounds from other believers that are also in my body of believers that I have to see then. And even through all of that, God is moving. And those things, I feel like, man, read the word, pray, and get with a local congregation and join them every week without fail, if at all possible. That feels absolutely essential to get me down the path of, God, I want to know you. I want more of you, and I need you to transform me. And it's going to start there. There's a couple other spiritual disciplines. There's so many we could talk about, but there's two others I wanted to talk about, and maybe Jimmy, you can speak to these a little bit. They're ones that we both practice that I feel like have been so helpful in both of our walks with God, but yet feel kind of like forgotten in our modern context. And the two that I'm thinking of are fasting and Sabbathing, or resting, taking kind of a day of rest. And those two things are types of spiritual disciplines that we see even in the New Testament, right? With Jesus and his disciples, we see them still being practiced. We don't see any sense of them being cast off because Jesus has come. These are practices that Jesus, if anything, assumes will happen. He says, when you fast, or he advocates for the Sabbath, says Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so you see him holding these things up. But again, I think they're kind of modern in the sense in our modern age, they're kind of forgotten. And so,
yeah, I agree.
maybe which one do you want to talk about first?
It doesn't matter.
Let's talk about Sabbath first.
Sabbath. Okay, there it was.
There you go. Because we call our Sabbath our do nothing day.
True.
And we both practice that together. But yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, why it matters, and what that looks like for us?
Well, I think first off, it's a pattern you see in Scripture. It's obviously a huge deal in the Old Testament, written right into the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. But from the earliest pages of Scripture in Genesis, you're already seeing the pattern set out in in His actual creation of the universe. The Sabbath is sort of proclaimed in God resting on the seventh day, and that being a model for His people. And of course, we know that this is Israel on the cusp of getting into the Promised Land, who's reading Genesis for the first time, having gotten the commandments from Moses and those types of things. So it's reinforced. It's putting in the very sort of fabric of creation this rhythm that God sees for His people of rest. I think it's worth saying that there is controversy around Sabbath keeping, so that's probably worth saying. And the debate is like, is it like do not murder? Like, are we really talking about the same thing as like if you kill a guy, or if you work on Sunday, that somehow like right. And so there's debate among Christians in that respect. And the New Testament is going to, I think, make the argument. It doesn't make it as quite on the nose as I would like, maybe, but I think it makes a compelling argument for Jesus certainly being our Sabbath rest. We know that He calls Himself, and I believe it's Matthew 12, He says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Kelly alluded to the fact that Jesus is sort of reframing the Sabbath for us, and that He's saying, hey, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. And then we understand in Hebrews 3 and 4 that God sort of gives us a spiritual sort of framing and meaning of the Sabbath. There's a Sabbath rest for the people of God that the writer of Hebrews talks about. And so I feel very comfortable when I'm talking to other believers saying Jesus is He is our Sabbath rest. He is the fulfillment of the Sabbath in such a way that the moral ought of it has been satisfied in Christ, and yet that doesn't mean that there is no value in it as a practice and a discipline. So the Sabbath has always been pointing to Jesus. That's the thing we got to establish. The Sabbath has been a hint, a finger pointing toward Christ coming, who ultimately for us is the place where we go to find our rest from our works, which is what I think the work that Hebrews 4 is doing. But we still are embodied people who just the fact is we need rest. So you have this principle running through the Scriptures that I think it's right for us to go back to and say, hey, Sabbathing is a good and proper discipline for us, even though I feel very comfortable saying Jesus is my Sabbath rest. And so I don't need to keep the Sabbath in the same way that the Jews under the Mosaic covenant needed to keep the Sabbath. So that's how I would understand it. But also, we Sabbath every week, and we virtually never miss that. Sometimes we do, but virtually never. So I wouldn't make it a moral ought in that way, but I would say we're definitely in wisdom folly territory, and I think there's a ton of wisdom in taking those rests weekly. I mean, we already do it daily when we sleep, and gosh, we have just found it to be so refreshing for us. What Sabbath does is it preaches a sermon.
Yes.
That's what it's doing. It preaches a sermon. For us, it's on Mondays. But it preaches a sermon to us every Monday that you are not the ruler of the universe. Yahweh is. And you've got a ton of stuff to do. But you're not going to do it, Jimmy. You're going to sit there and you're going to play with your kids, you're going to talk to your wife, and you're going to make pancakes with food coloring in it, and you're going to joke about how the green pancakes were made from boogers for your kids, and they're going to laugh, and it's going to be amazing.
And then you're going to sleep on the couch for 2 hours.
I'm going to sleep on the couch for 2 hours. The Lord definitely did will that for me to do that. But it's preaching a sermon to my heart that the labor is the Lord's, not mine. Unless the Lord builds a house, Psalm 127, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. So for us, we're not perfect with it. We forget this truth all the time, but it's good to be reminded when you're Sabbathing, you are preaching sermons to yourself. And the sermon is, I'm not the king. The king is the king. Right. I don't do the work. He does the work. This is actually a micro picture of what the gospel is.
That's right.
I don't labor for salvation. He labored on my behalf for my salvation. And so I think appreciating it even from a parable standpoint is really helpful. And the same is true in a lot of ways of what fasting is doing as well. We can talk more about that. But
well, for what it's worth, Sabbathing is really hard for me. I'm such a task-oriented doer that every and that's why we call it a do nothing day. We just renamed it because we were like, that's the goal of the day. The goal is to accomplish nothing. And that helps me to know that's the goal. And I hate that goal. I want to get stuff done, and I'm aware every time of all these things. There's laundry to do, and there's chores to do, and there's things to return, and there's emails to respond to, and we take Mondays off because he's a pastor, and Mondays when everybody else is sending emails and trying to get stuff done, and here I am sitting on the couch in my pajamas. I'm like, this feels so wrong. So those feelings are normal for what it's worth. And it has helped me practically to write for myself a list of things that are expressions of rest for me, to give myself something to do. Because I think it's okay to do things, but the point is I'm not going to accomplish things. So some of the things I do are read novels, do puzzles, go on walks. It's like those are things that I enjoy, but they're not in an effort to make progress in my goals and to check things off a list. And it's in an effort of today's goal is to remember I'm not needed. And that my job as a Christian is to rest in somebody else's works. And that's actually really hard to do. Yeah. But that's this essence of what faith is. I'm going to not look at my works. I'm going to look at somebody else's.
And the same sort of counterintuitive thing is seen in fasting. You know, I think one of the reasons we don't do either of those as much as people is it just feels so intuitive. And I mean, literally with fasting, it's like, I'm doing something that will stop me existing if I do it too long. You know, like I want to do things that keep me existing, and this stops that. But fasting is something that we try to practice too. You know, you guys have probably, if you've grown up in church, you've heard sermons on the Sermon on the Mount, and I think it's pastors are right to point out that Jesus assumes fasting. When you fast, don't do it like the Pharisees. So the issue is not should you, shouldn't you. The issue is what type of fasting are you doing? And, you know, for me as a recovering glutton, you know, some of you know my story. I've battled a ton with overeating over the years, weight issues, all that stuff. Fasting has been really helpful for me to just to tell my body true things, to tell my mouth, tell my stomach true things about who really satisfies. That it's not this next promised meal that I'm so sure is going to scratch every sort of itch, you know, in me. It's Him. And fasting is, it's not just abstaining, you know, it's abstaining to enjoy. This is not a verse on fasting, but I think a good comparison is 2 Timothy 2:22, where Paul says, "Flee youthful lusts, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with others who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." There's a both and for Paul. It's never just get away from this stuff. It's get away from this so that you can pursue the better thing. And I think that's also true with fasting. It's like if we're talking about food fasts, I'm leaving this, but I'm replacing it not just with nothing. I'm replacing it with prayer. I'm replacing it with contemplation on the things of God. I'm replacing it with I'm allowing my hunger pangs to be prayer triggers now. I'm not just going, oh my gosh, I want that burrito. I'm going, oh my gosh, I want that burrito, and ought this be how I feel about you, Lord? Because I don't. If I'm being honest, I don't feel. I want some soul hunger pangs, Lord. You know, that's what ought to be rising up in us in a fast moment. So I definitely have a love-hate relationship with it.
Oh man, fast days. Now I'm pregnant right now. If you guys didn't know that, so I'm not actually practicing fasting the same way.
She's like super pregnant, by the way. We're like 5 weeks away.
So I just wisdom-wise, like there is. Like, if you are in a place with your health that you can't do that, please don't do that. But we have often done this together, too. And I'm like, oh, no, it's a fast day. Dang it. I was really looking forward to breakfast, you know? And it is just, that's real. So just know we feel that. And it does become a way to pray and say, Lord, gosh, could I just feel that way about you? It just becomes something you pray. And gosh, it's so good to remember I can say no to these things.
That's right.
There's something about creating it as a discipline that forces you to say no to things like food that we tend to just run to. I do think we go to food as a quick and easy escape for our stress, maybe times when we should be talking to God about what's really creating anxiety, but we're just going to eat a bag of chips instead. Now we've created a day, possibly, where we're going, I can't do that. I have to talk to God now. I mean, that sounds so like I don't want to, but we don't want to a lot. We're always retraining ourselves to go, who is the better bread? Who is the better wine? Who is the better living water? And part of the way that I live that is to abstain from food, which I did just want to make a comment that when the Bible talks about fasting, it is talking about fasting from food. Though I think it's fine to talk about social media fast and fast from other things. I think that's actually really great. We've done that. But when the Bible talks about fasting, this is what it's talking about. It's talking about abstaining from food for a period of time for the sake of seeking God, and also for the sake of praying for certain things, whether it be wisdom for things or like we see the disciples praying for healing that Jesus encouraged them.
Right.
This demon doesn't come out by prayer and fasting. So
a great book on this is Hunger for God by John Piper. Super transformative for me. He has this line in the book, and then we can be done with this. Let me see if I can draw it up from the depths. He says something to the effect of, when we don't find inside ourselves a hunger for God, it is not the case that we have eaten, that we feasted on God and are satisfied, but rather we have nibbled so long at the table of the world that we are too stuffed to enjoy the greater thing. And that for me was such a sword to my soul of like, and this is a great test for you. It's just a great thing for you to ponder. Like, do I long for God? Do I hunger for Him? Or is there not an appetite there? Could it be that you lack an appetite, not because you've had your fill of God, but because you've nibbled so long at the table of the world that you're too stuffed to enjoy the better meal that is Him? Gosh, that has just convicted me so much. And I think fasting helps poke at that a lot. So.
Well, and before we move on from fasting, I want to just give a few practical, get real granular here for a second, because it's such a not practiced discipline that we've kind of alluded to some of them. But if you're interested in getting into a discipline of fasting, here's just a couple suggestions. Like all things, start small. And so that could be like once a week, you're going to skip one meal and you are going to fast that meal. That could be dinner on Sunday night, or that could be lunch on Wednesdays, but you're going to not overeat the breakfast that morning, right? And don't compensate. I'm going to abstain from this one meal once a week. And then I would actually say, if you can find somebody to start this practice with, I actually think that's a great asset. Now, to just say, Jesus says, when we practice these disciplines, we're not to go do it to be showy and all of that, right? Don't go announce to the world that you're fasting. I don't think this is doing that. I think fasting is a hard discipline for us. And so if you can find a friend or somebody in your life who you think might be interested in this as well, pick that one friend, and in the privacy of the two of you, don't announce it to the world, but just go, can we do this together? Because I don't know if I can do it by myself. And can we pick a day to fast one meal, fast 2 meals? Because I think it really does help to have the accountability of someone else is doing this with me, to stick with it. And then to maybe talk about what we learned afterwards, like, how did it go for you today? I was praying for you as I was praying for my own soul. Like, that can be really helpful. So start small. Talk to a doctor if you need to, but then start small and do it with a friend if you can. And make sure, like Jimmy said, that you're not just abstaining, you're also seeking something else. That feels super important in that discipline. But again, all of these things, Sabbathing, fasting, they are ships, right? That are not the main point. They are a means to an end. Fasting's not the point. Sabbathing's not the point. Those things carry us to the person of God and help us find deeper fellowship and intimacy with Him, which is what we're after. We want more of God, and these are some of the ways that we do it. Thanks for joining us today. We hope that this has been a helpful conversation for you, maybe given you some ideas to just how to apply these things in your own life. If you have any other questions about that, remember, you can send us an email at question@clearlypodcast.com. We'd love to hear maybe any other concerns or thoughts you have. So send us an email there. Again, that's question@clearlypodcast.com. Tell us what you're thinking about the topic of spiritual disciplines.
We will see you guys next time. Thanks for sticking in with us. Looking forward to what's coming. Bye.